Hello family, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please subscribe and drop a like for us. This generosity would go a long way for us. Also share to family and friends. And please turn on post notification to stay tuned for more. Thank you as you do so. Now let's get into the story. The house on Balaji Crescent stood still like a photograph, where every object had its place but nothing truly lived anymore. Outside, hawkers shouted about ripe pawpaws and hot akra, while inside, Ma stirred her baby's pap like a woman stirring her own silence. Zara, barely 6 months old, had cried through most of the night, her tiny lungs loud enough to reach the heavens, yet Mark had not once turned in their bed. He had faced the wall, pretending sleep, as though the sound of his own blood pumping through guilt wasn't louder than the child's cries. Ma's hands trembled faintly as she spooned the food into Zara's mouth, tiny, careful scoops, like feeding a fragile bird. Her body ached in places she didn't even know had bones. The mirror beside the wardrobe reflected a stranger, hair unkempt, lips dry, eyes rimmed red from crying at night and smiling by day. Yet, she said nothing. Mark no longer kissed her goodbye in the mornings. He barely acknowledged her presence beyond the plate of food and his pressed shirts. When he looked at her now, it was as if he was watching the last ember of a dying flame. His silence was sharp, not gentle, like a knife that sliced without bleeding. And Ma, though buried in diapers and sleeplessness, felt every inch of that blade. She used to be the woman who danced barefoot in the rain and laughed until she coughed. But now, even her joy had gone mute, like a drum beaten underwater. Her body had shifted after childbirth, hips wider, stomach softer. She noticed how he glanced at her when she changed clothes, the way someone looks at a wall they once painted with love, now chipped and faded. But Ma still held her silence like a cloak wrapped tightly around her. There were no raised voices, no accusations, just the slow erosion of intimacy, like water carving through stone. Evenings in the house crawled like an old man with bad knees. Zara would nap, and Ma would sit by the window, counting cars instead of moments. She thought about how quickly love could become duty, and how quickly duty could feel like punishment. Mark came home later each night. At first, it was 8, then 10, and soon, even midnight didn't surprise her. He always had an excuse tucked neatly behind his lips: traffic, meetings, unexpected calls. But lies have a smell, and Ma had begun to breathe it in deeply. It clung to him like stale perfume. He no longer asked how she was. He didn't notice the tear in her wrapper or the days she forgot to eat. Once, she fell asleep on the floor with Zara in her arms, and when he returned, he simply stepped over them and went into the room. That night, she watched his back rise and fall as he slept, her fingers itching to reach out. Not to hold him, but to shake him awake. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered to herself, "You're still here." And that must count for something. Yet even her own voice sounded foreign. Her mother had warned her once, "Marriage is not for children, my daughter. It is a place of deep waters. You must learn to swim without splashing." And so Ma swam, each day a stroke, each night a breath held under waves of loneliness. But under her silence, something else began to stir. Not bitterness, not rage, but clarity. A seed buried deep in the quiet soil of her heart. She began to write again, something she hadn't done since university. Thoughts scribbled into the back of her daughter's diaper boxes. Sentences laced with suspicion and sadness. The pen felt good in her hand, like a sword she was quietly sharpening. The first time Ma truly suspected another woman was when Mark returned from Enugu smelling like hotel soap and peppered goat meat. Not the kind she cooked, his favorite, but a different kind, soaked in spices and arrogance. She asked how the trip went, and he answered with a shrug. Same old meetings. His words dropped like stones in a shallow bucket, too heavy to be real. She noticed the mark on his neck, faint but fresh, the kind left by someone who thought she owned him, even if for a night. But Ma didn't ask questions. Instead, she offered him his dinner and watched how he barely touched it. That night, she lay beside him like a stranger on a bus seat, close yet worlds apart. Her thoughts were loud, like market women arguing over change, but her face remained unreadable. A week later, she found a receipt tucked inside his shirt pocket. Amber Flame Lounge, Enugu, 2 bottles of wine, Quobi, fried snail, and Guess Sweet 17. She stared at it for a long time, her breath steady, her fingers tight around the paper. Then she folded it gently and placed it between the pages of her journal. Not for confrontation, not yet. She understood that some wars are not fought with fists or fire, but with time and intelligence. She didn't want to accuse and be lied to. No. She wanted to be sure. A part of her still hoped she was wrong, that maybe she was building storms in her head. But the signs were growing, like weeds in an unkempt garden. Mark had started humming in the shower again, the way he used to when they first fell in love. Only now the song was not hers. There were days she watched Zara sleep and wondered if it was worth holding the marriage together just for her. She loved her child with the kind of love that could tear open the earth, but even that love could not silence the ache in her chest. She would imagine herself packing up, starting again, somewhere far, maybe Port Harcourt or Benin, where no one knew her name, where she could breathe without having to pretend she wasn't drowning. But something kept her rooted. Not fear, not shame, patience. The kind of patience born from quiet suffering. She began to notice little things. Mark's phone always face down, a woman's name saved as electrician, and once a missed call labeled transport guy that called back and giggled when she answered. She didn't react, just memorized the number. Later that night, she dialed it using a neighbor's phone. A woman answered in a syrupy voice. "Mark baby, why are you calling me with another number?" Ma ended the call without a word and sat in the dark, her hands steady, her heartbeat like thunder buried deep underground. Her silence was no longer weakness, it was observation. Her pain had ripened into strategy. She began to act forgetful, to cook less often, to let her hair stay uncombed. If she was going to be seen as invisible, then let her truly disappear in plain sight. Mark believed she had lost herself to motherhood. That was his mistake. He didn't know she was quietly building the pieces of her comeback. Because even in brokenness, a woman like Ma does not lose her essence. She only sharpens it in silence. Mark's first visit to Enugu hadn't been planned. It was one of those sudden work trips that came wrapped in tight timelines and vague presentations. He boarded the evening flight from Lagos with a small laptop bag and a head full of excuses he hadn't yet told. Ma had helped him iron his clothes and pack the essentials, her hands moving with mechanical grace while her mind wandered into unfamiliar waters. She kissed him goodbye at the gate, not out of passion but out of habit. When the plane touched down and the cab dropped him in front of Sunrise Executive Hotel, a tired building with shiny floors and bored receptionists, Mark felt strangely untethered. The city felt slower than Lagos, more forgiving. He could walk without being swallowed by horns and crowd. That first night, after the brief meeting that wrapped up quicker than anticipated, he wandered into a restaurant just 2 streets from his hotel, looking more for distraction than food. The sign read "The Fire Pot," and the smell of grilled meat floated into the road like a hand pulling passers-by inside. He entered, sat near the window, and ordered something spicy without checking the menu. The air inside smelled of fried oil and something sweeter. Then she walked over, Jody, her voice as casual as a breeze but her eyes sharper than kitchen knives. Her skin was the color of roasted cashew, and she wore confidence like perfume. When she laughed, Mark forgot for a moment that he had a child who still cried in the middle of the night. Jody didn't ask many questions. She poured him a drink, teased his tie, and told him he looked like a man who'd forgotten how to enjoy himself. It wasn't the words that got him, it was the way she said them, like she was handing him permission to stop pretending. The following evening he returned, not for the food, but for the fire she had lit inside him. That second night, she wore a black fitted blouse and served him akpa and peppered snail, food he hadn't eaten since his bachelor days in Succa. She remembered his name without asking, leaned forward when he spoke, and made him feel seen in a way that had nothing to do with diapers or dishes. Mark, who had once prided himself on being the responsible husband, found himself slipping easily into this new rhythm. He told himself it was harmless. Just conversation. Just a few drinks. But temptation rarely comes with red warning lights. It often walks in quietly, dressed as comfort. And Jody was comfort, wrapped in laughter and small lies. When she mentioned she lived close to the bar, it didn't take long before Mark's car keys jingled their way into her apartment. That night, the thunderstorm that roared through Enugu streets had nothing on the fire between them. And as he lay in her bed, watching the ceiling swirl in silence, he convinced himself that what he had done was understandable. After all, Ma had changed. She no longer looked at him with the hunger she once did. She was always tired, always wrapped in faded wrappers and motherhood. He blamed her, not loudly, but in his mind, as if betrayal became justified simply because the other person had grown weary. But deep down, he knew what he was doing. Each visit to Enugu became less about work and more about escape. The guilt dulled like old scissors. He began to dream of Jody, even when he lay next to his wife. And when the opportunity came to transfer temporarily to the Eastern Branch for quarterly audits, he didn't hesitate. The air in Lagos had grown too tight for his double life. Enugu offered breathing space and distraction. After 3 trips and many secret nights, Jody started asking questions. Not about his job or meetings, but about his home. "You ever think of leaving?" she asked once, the light from the bedside lamp carving gentle shadows on her cheekbones. Mark laughed nervously. "It's not that easy," he said, which wasn't a no. She didn't press, but the question lingered like perfume on old fabric. Jody didn't love him, at least not in the way novels describe, but she liked the way he treated her. She liked the weekend money he handed her without her asking, the way he touched her waist in public like she was something he earned. She imagined a future, not with wedding bells, but with upgraded status. And so she planted an idea in Mark's ear during a late-night conversation. "You look like you need help at home. You say your wife's always tired, right? What if you hired someone to help her out? Someone like me." She said it with a playful grin, but her eyes were serious. Mark chuckled, waved her off, but later that night, as he looked out of her window at the quiet Enugu street, the idea circled back. A cook. A helper. Someone to support Ma. He could dress it in concern and sell it as love. The lie would sound noble. He told himself it would make things easier, Jody under his roof, within reach, hidden in plain sight. All he had to do was convince Ma. And in his mind, Ma was too tired, too distracted, too worn out to see clearly anymore. Back in Lagos, the conversation played out exactly how he imagined. One Sunday afternoon, while Zara was asleep and the house smelled faintly of yam porridge, Mark leaned against the kitchen door and said, "You've been doing too much lately. I think we should hire a cook to ease your burden. Someone live in." Ma didn't look up immediately. She was rinsing plates, her hands moving slowly under the cold water. "Okay," she said after a pause, her voice level. "If you think it'll help." Mark blinked, surprised at how easily she agreed. He had expected a bit of resistance, maybe questions. But Ma gave him none. That night, he booked Jody's bus ticket from Enugu and told her to pack light. Ma watched him texting someone, his back turned. She didn't ask who. She simply wiped her hands on a towel and went upstairs. Alone in her room, she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the baby monitor, listening to Zara's soft breathing. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with the child's, but her thoughts were no longer tangled in confusion. She had seen the signs, the missed calls, the mysterious lipstick stain on his shirt collar, the sudden showers before bed, the change in cologne. A woman knows when another woman has stepped onto her territory. But Ma didn't scream. She didn't confront. Instead, she made space, on the shelf, in the wardrobe, in her mind. Because she needed Jody close. She needed to see the face behind the whispers. She needed to look into her rival's eyes and confirm the truth. And most of all, she needed to let Mark believe he had won. Because sometimes the best way to trap a rat is not to chase it, but to let it feel safe enough to come out. Jody arrived in Lagos on a Wednesday afternoon with a red duffel bag, lips glossy like she was heading for a photo shoot, not a family home. The compound gate creaked open as she stepped in, wearing the smile of a woman who had studied her entrance in a mirror. Ma watched from the upstairs window, expression unreadable, like a queen inspecting a visitor from her tower. When Mark introduced them in the parlor, Jody extended her hand with an over-rehearsed smile, her voice sugary. "Good afternoon, Ma. Thank you for welcoming me into your home." Ma shook her hand gently, her touch soft but firm, her eyes studying the girl like she was a riddle only time would solve. "You're welcome," Ma replied calmly. "The kitchen's downstairs. You'll find everything you need." There was no sarcasm in her tone, no hint of confrontation, just unsettling composure. Over the next few days, Jody blended into the rhythm of the house like she belonged. She woke early, cooked well, and laughed a little too much at Mark's dry jokes. Her stew had the kind of taste that made men ask for second helpings, and she wore leggings in the kitchen like she didn't know someone else's husband passed through there often. Mark started coming home early again, suddenly invested in dinner conversations, praising the meals as if his mouth had just discovered flavor. Ma didn't flinch. She ate quietly, nodded occasionally, and excused herself once she fed Zara and cleared her plate. Her silence was not the silence of defeat. It was the kind of quiet that builds a library of secrets. Each day she observed Jody, how she spoke when she lingered near Mark, the way she wore her wrapper higher when Ma was around, lower when she wasn't. Ma didn't need proof anymore. The evidence was walking around in her house, seasoning her soup with betrayal. What Jody didn't understand was that Ma had grown used to pain, and women who carry pain for too long develop a kind of inner armor, one that no flirtation or hidden lipstick can pierce easily. The girl mistook her silence for blindness, her kindness for ignorance. She started testing boundaries in subtle ways. One morning, Ma entered the sitting room to find Jody watching a TV show while folding laundry, wearing one of Mark's t-shirts, oversized but unmistakably his. Ma paused for just a moment, then continued walking past without a word. Another evening, Jody served Mark his food before Ma returned from bathing Zara, plated and waiting at the table with a glass of juice, like a wife auditioning for a role. Mark smiled and complimented the flavor, licking his fingers in that exaggerated way men do when trying to prove satisfaction. When Ma sat to eat, her portion was smaller, barely enough. She said nothing, just ate slowly, each spoonful measured, like she was counting time. Jody noticed her silence, and mistook it for surrender. But Ma was not folding, she was learning. Every woman knows that in the presence of a rival, patience is either foolishness or strategy. And Ma had no intention of being the fool. She began to rearrange small things, moved the salt to a different cabinet, placed the spices on a different shelf. She noted how long it took Jody to adjust, how often she called her Ma, how easily she slipped into habits she didn't earn. At night, while Mark and Jody exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking, Ma lay awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling fan, mind churning like a blender with no lid. She wasn't sure yet how she would respond, but she knew she had no intention of walking away. A woman who had pushed life out of her body, who had endured the fire of childbirth and the fog of postpartum loneliness, could not be outsmarted by someone who hadn't yet weathered real storms. Weeks passed, and Jody began to feel more confident, the way a fox does when it believes the farmer has stopped checking the traps. She started humming while cooking, playing music in the kitchen, sometimes dancing softly while slicing onions. Ma would pass by, watching her quietly, her expression betraying nothing. One day, Ma returned from the market to find Jody on the couch, scrolling through Mark's phone. She wasn't snooping, she had the password. That was the moment Ma's plan sharpened. If Jody had the kind of access that Mark once swore was reserved for only one woman, then she had crossed into territory that required action. Ma didn't shout. She didn't confront. Instead, she bought a small camera, disguised as a wall clock, and placed it in the dining room. Another, smaller one, shaped like a pen, was fixed between old recipe books in the kitchen. She had done her research, read blogs, watched videos. The camera was motion-activated and recorded audio. She tested it quietly one afternoon by talking to herself. The recording worked. That night, she pretended to have a headache and went to bed early, leaving Mark and Jody downstairs. The next morning, she reviewed the footage. The way Jody leaned over Mark, whispering something about how she'll get used to us eventually. Mark had laughed. She's not the fighting type, he'd said. As long as she doesn't stress me, we're good. Ma watched this with a still face. No tears. No trembling. Just a long exhale. She transferred the video to a USB drive and hid it in the hem of one of Zara's old baby clothes. Her plan was no longer forming, it had matured. What remained was the timing. Like ripe fruit, revenge needs the right season, the right weather, and the right appetite. What Mark hadn't noticed was that Ma had started changing in quiet, invisible ways. She no longer waited for him to eat dinner together. She bathed before him, went to bed before him, stopped asking where he was coming from or when he'd be home. It wasn't distance, it was strategy. When a woman stops trying, she's no longer angry, she's watching. She had also started jogging in the mornings. At first, it was just to clear her head. But soon, she was running with purpose, body getting firmer, steps lighter. She wore her hair differently now, braided into thick, neat lines that framed her face with strength. Neighbors began to notice. The security man at the gate complimented her new perfume one morning. She smiled and thanked him, her laughter effortless, not for show. Even Zara seemed to notice the shift. Her cries were fewer, her naps longer. Mark didn't pay attention, too busy laughing at something on his phone, while Jody washed his clothes on Saturday mornings. The man who once begged Ma for her time now found her absence convenient. He mistook her peace for emotional distance. He didn't know that Ma was drawing lines around herself, not to isolate, but to prepare. She had also started visiting a lawyer. Quietly, without a word. She asked questions about custody, assets, shared property. The lawyer didn't pry, just answered with the calm professionalism of someone who had heard this story too many times. Ma left the office with a brown envelope of documents and a mind clearer than it had been in months. She went home that day and made ogbono soup with enough spice to remind Mark of the woman he thought he'd outgrown. That night, he said, "This tastes different. You used to cook like this when we were dating." Ma smiled faintly. "Maybe I'm becoming myself again." And when she turned away, her smile faded. She wasn't becoming herself again. She was becoming something he would never recognize. The weather had started shifting, and with it, the energy in the house began to lean in directions only the sensitive could feel. Rain returned to Lagos in sudden outbursts, pouring hard, then stopping as if it had changed its mind halfway through. The house was cooler now, but the air inside had grown thick, unspoken tension hanging between rooms like invisible cobwebs. Ma had settled into her new rhythm, a kind of quiet dominance that didn't ask for permission. She spoke less, but her silence had weight, and her presence carried a precision that left no corner of the house untouched. She began to rearrange her bedroom, moved the bed slightly away from the wall, changed the curtain to something darker, started diffusing oils that gave the room the scent of eucalyptus and lemon balm. It wasn't to impress Mark, it was to reclaim her space. Jody, on the other hand, had started overstepping without realizing the line had already been drawn. One morning, she came into the sitting room wearing the same wrapper Ma had worn weeks before, a faded Ankara pattern that wasn't flashy, just familiar. Ma noticed, sipped her tea, and said nothing. But in her mind, she tucked that detail into a growing mental file labeled Jody's boldness. Mark remained oblivious, even beginning to refer to Jody by her first name when they spoke in front of Ma. "Jody, please pass me the remote," he said casually one evening. Ma didn't flinch. She simply picked up her phone and began to type. Her notes were no longer emotional outbursts but strategic records, dates, tones, eye movements, meal preferences. A timeline of decline. It wasn't just about infidelity anymore. It was about documenting disrespect with the precision of a seasoned archivist. The girl in her house wasn't just a mistress. She was an intruder made comfortable by a man who had grown blind to the storm forming in front of him. There were nights Ma lay awake listening to footsteps in the hallway, their patterns, their weight. Mark now left their bedroom, often after pretending to sleep beside her. Sometimes he returned before dawn, smelling like grilled suya and expensive perfume. Other times, he stayed out entirely and tiptoed back with the same clumsy guilt of a boy who'd stolen meat from the pot. Ma never said a word. She would rise early, bathe Zara, tidy the sitting room, and prepare breakfast without expression. Jody often came late to the kitchen, yawning dramatically, stretching in ways that exposed more than necessary. She carried herself like a shadow that had stopped pretending to be invisible. On one particular morning, Ma watched her slice tomatoes, her fingers moving carelessly, nearly cutting herself. "You're not concentrating," Ma said, without looking up from the pot she was stirring. Jody froze, then laughed awkwardly. "Sorry, Ma. Didn't sleep well." Ma glanced at her just once. "Then maybe you should stop sleeping where you're not welcome." It wasn't a threat. It wasn't even loud. But it landed like a slap. Jody said nothing and continued slicing, her laughter gone. From that day, Ma's demeanor changed again. She started wearing her old earrings, the ones Mark once complimented as making her look dangerous in a good way. She no longer avoided mirrors. Her smile returned, slow but deliberate, like a sun breaking through fog. On Sundays, she played gospel music louder than necessary. Not because she was worshiping, but because she wanted the house to remember what peace used to sound like. Mark noticed the shift but misread it. "You seem to be doing better these days," he said one afternoon. Ma turned to him with a calmness that made the air pause. "I'm not better. I'm just awake now." Mark laughed, but something about her voice unsettled him. He couldn't tell if she was healing or preparing for war. That was the same week the first incident happened. Mark came home with a slight limp, his eyes bloodshot, his breath stale with alcohol. Jody rushed to meet him, concerned, but he waved her off. "Just fell at the car park. I'm fine." Ma said nothing, only observed. She knew his temper had grown brittle. He snapped at Zara the next day, when she knocked over his phone. The girl began to cry, and Ma scooped her up instantly, holding her with the firmness of a mother protecting her young from a rattlesnake. "She's a baby," Ma said coldly. "If you're so irritated by her presence, maybe you should live alone." Mark didn't respond. He stormed out of the house that night, and Ma knew exactly where he went. But this time she followed, carefully 2 cars behind. She parked down the street from a roadside pepper soup joint, and watched from the shadows as Jody came out the back, giggling as Mark pulled her into a tight embrace. They sat, shared a bottle of stout, then left together, walking like two careless teenagers toward a nearby guest house. Ma didn't cry. She didn't shake. She simply started her engine and drove home slowly, mind-weaving plans with the clarity of someone who had been pushed beyond heartbreak. By the time they returned in the early hours, she had already made her decision. That morning, she changed the locks on the kitchen cupboards, moved the gas cylinder, and put Zara's documents in her handbag. Her silence that day had a rhythm. Her eyes had a new sharpness. And when Mark came into the kitchen, frowning at the missing lighter, she handed him his breakfast and said, "Let me know when you're ready to talk like a man. Or eat like one." Then she walked away, leaving him holding a plate of steaming silence. Ma had begun to prepare her final act. She visited her lawyer again, this time with full clarity. "I want to be ready," she said, her tone firm. The lawyer nodded and reviewed her file. Custody would be straightforward. Mark had no legal ground. Property would be messier. But Ma wasn't trying to burn the house down. She wanted the keys. She returned home and started moving items quietly into a small storage unit. Important documents, jewelry, some of Zara's clothes, even the backup hard drive that contained her camera footage. The devices had captured more than enough: touches, kisses, whispered plans. She made backups on a USB and placed it inside an envelope marked for emergency. Then she slid it beneath her old Bible in the wardrobe. One night, she heard Jody on the phone, speaking softly. He said she's not suspecting anything. We'll wait a bit longer. Ma was seated on the stairs, listening unseen. That night, she didn't sleep. She laid next to Zara and counted the seconds between breaths. At dawn, she stood at the mirror and asked herself aloud, "Are you ready?" Her reflection did not blink. She took it as a yes. That week, she cooked with an energy Mark hadn't seen in months. He complimented her food again, even laughed at one of her dry jokes. Jody grew quieter. Perhaps she felt the wind shift. Perhaps the spirits of women always knew when another woman had stopped surviving and started planning. The day before it all changed, Ma went to the market and bought goat meat, uziza leaves, and red oil. She cleaned the kitchen herself and laid out 3 place settings. When Mark asked if there was an occasion, she said, "A special dinner. You and Jody have been so helpful. It's time I show appreciation." Mark raised a brow but said nothing. Jody smiled awkwardly. And Ma smiled back. Not the kind of smile that hides pain. The kind that announces, very gently, that the play is over. By evening, the dining room looked like something out of a celebration. The table was set with clean white linen, plates polished until they reflected candlelight like mirrors, and 3 glasses stood waiting, half filled with freshly squeezed zobo. Ma had lit 2 candles at both ends of the table, their flames dancing gently with the wind leaking through the louvered windows. The aroma of spiced goat meat stew filled the house, coating every room with memory and something deeper. Mark walked in first, stopping briefly in the doorway like he had entered the wrong house. He glanced at the table, confused but curious, his eyes catching the perfectly laid pounded yam and the steaming bowls beside it. "What's the occasion?" he asked, voice lighter than it had been in weeks. Ma appeared from the kitchen in a deep green wrapper and matching top, her hair tied neatly, and her earrings dangling with an old elegance. "No occasion," she replied with a small smile. "Just thought we should eat well together as a family. One last time." Her words were gentle, but they hung in the air like thunderclouds without rain. Jody came in shortly after, pausing when she saw the setting. She looked from the food to Ma, eyes narrowing slightly, suspicious. Ma motioned to the chairs. "Please sit. I cooked it myself. Special recipe. Just like old times." The guests obeyed. They sat, picked up cutlery, and began to eat, not knowing they were sinking slowly into a meal they would never forget. The first few spoons went down without question. Mark nodded in approval, chewing with satisfaction. "You haven't cooked like this in a long time," he said between bites. "The pepper is balanced. You put uziza, right?" Jody echoed the compliment, albeit more reservedly, pushing pieces of meat into her mouth with the caution of someone used to power games. Ma smiled again, her expression steady, her hands calm on her lap. She didn't touch her food. Instead, she sipped from her glass occasionally, observing both of them like a host watching guests eat at a farewell dinner. The silence stretched until Mark finally noticed. "You're not eating?" he asked. "I already had mine while cooking," she replied. "I wanted to make sure your portions were complete." He chuckled lightly, unaware of the weight behind her words. "This meat tastes familiar," he said again. You remember the naming ceremony soup? It reminds me of that. Jody nodded slowly. It's sweet, spicy but not too much. I like the way the meat pulls apart. There was a long pause. Ma leaned forward, clasping her hands together gently. Good. I'm glad you both enjoyed it, she said softly. Then her eyes shifted to Jody. How's your stomach feeling? Jody blinked. Stomach? I'm fine, I guess. Why? No reason, Ma answered, rising from her chair and walking to the cabinet near the fridge. She returned with a brown envelope and placed it on the table, in the space between the bowls and empty plates. Mark looked at it with mild confusion. What's this? He asked. Ma exhaled a deep, slow breath that seemed to steady the room. That, she said carefully, is a copy of everything I've recorded over the last month. You'll find footage, audio files, and some printed screenshots. You might want to open it when you're alone. Or maybe don't. For the first time, Mark's expression shifted from curiosity to alarm. He looked at Jody, then back at Ma, suddenly aware of the calm behind her eyes. What are you talking about? He asked. Ma tilted her head slightly. Do you want me to explain it here? Or would you prefer we continue over dessert? Her tone wasn't mocking. It was terrifying in its composure. Jody pushed back her chair slightly. Wait, are you saying you've been recording us? Recording? Ma echoed the word with a trace of laughter. No, I've been preserving the truth. In this house, the lies have been speaking too loudly. It was time the truth had a voice. Mark stood up, suddenly angry. Ma, what is all this nonsense? She didn't move. Sit down, Mark. Don't embarrass yourself more than you already have. You know, I used to think I was the weak one in this marriage. You made me believe that silence meant stupidity. But the thing about quiet people is that they hear everything, even when the world is trying to pretend they're deaf. Jody looked from one to the other, her breathing now sharp. What did you put in the food? She whispered. Ma looked directly at her. Just goat meat. From the butcher. Why? Are you worried? Jody didn't answer. Her face was pale. Mark sat slowly, as if gravity had suddenly grown heavier. What do you want from us? He asked. Ma shrugged. Nothing. Just a little honesty. Just the acknowledgement that you both played your parts well in the play. But like every drama, it ends. She walked to the doorway then, her steps quiet but deliberate. Turning to them one last time, she said, The house is paid for until the end of the year. I'll send my lawyer to finalize the rest. You can decide amongst yourselves who gets to finish the stew. Then she picked up her handbag from the corner, opened the small drawer near the TV, and took out Zara's toy elephant. Her daughter's laughter echoed faintly from the monitor upstairs. Without looking back, Ma said, You should really wash that meat down with something. Zobo can be strong if you're not used to it. And with that, she left. The door clicked shut behind her like punctuation at the end of a powerful paragraph. Inside the house, silence grew loud. Mark didn't touch the envelope. Jody was already pacing. She opened her mouth to speak, but found no words. Mark finally picked up the envelope, opened it slowly, and as the pictures fell out onto the table, the truth stared back at him, sharper than any blade, colder than any betrayal. Hidden microphones, camera angles, a still shot of Jody, wearing Ma's slippers in the kitchen while Mark stood behind her shirtless. A printout of a WhatsApp chat with the caption, She doesn't suspect a thing. Mark's heart sank lower than it ever had. Not because he was caught, but because he knew that everything Ma had done had been deliberate, methodical, and merciless. She had been quiet. She had been patient. But now she had been heard. Loudly. The following morning began with birdsong and quietness that didn't quite fit the weight of the previous night. The compound that once echoed with early morning radio and the hiss of boiling kettles now seemed too calm, like a stage after the actors had left. The smell of Ma's peppered stew still lingered faintly in the curtains, but its warmth had turned cold. Mark sat on the edge of the sofa, the brown envelope still open in front of him, its contents scattered like memories he could no longer piece together. Jody was upstairs, her face pale, her voice quiet, as if the truth had stripped her vocal cords. She had barely spoken since Ma left, and even when she did, her words trailed off mid-sentence, unfinished thoughts wrapped in shame. Mark had tried to act unaffected, but the pictures wouldn't let him. Each time he blinked, he saw his own foolishness staring back, lazy kisses caught on camera, careless laughter beside the wrong woman. The house felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by a woman who had walked out without raising her voice, without shedding a tear, and somehow left behind thunder. He opened one of the recordings on a flash drive and heard his own voice, soft and foolish, telling Jody, "She's too drained to notice. She's not like she used to be." Then came Ma's voice, low, steady, recorded from a distance. "Things break when you stop looking after them. But sometimes broken things remember who dropped them." That line hadn't even been addressed to him, yet it landed like a slap. For the first time since their wedding, Mark couldn't find a way to defend himself, not to anyone else, and not even in the private court of his own mind. By the end of that week, Jody was gone. She packed her things in silence, using the early hours of dawn to avoid confrontation, her steps quick, her shoulders hunched like she was trying to make herself smaller. She didn't leave a note, and Mark didn't ask her to stay. Whatever illusion had brought them together had vanished with Ma's quiet departure. Mark tried to return to work, to normalcy, but nothing tasted right anymore. Coffee was too bitter, music too loud, shirts too tight. He would come home to an empty house, its silence no longer peaceful but punishing. Zara's room was bare, her toys gone, her tiny clothes missing from the drying line. He didn't know where Ma had gone. Her number rang but never connected. Mutual friends gave vague answers or admitted they hadn't seen her in weeks. The neighbors had stopped greeting him with the same warmth. The security man nodded stiffly now, as if protecting more than just a gate. Mark tried to distract himself, took walks, cooked occasionally, even attempted to clean, but nothing could scrub the guilt that had seeped into his skin. He stood in the kitchen one night, holding the same knife Jody once used to slice tomatoes, and for a moment he simply stared at it, not with despair, but with the emptiness of a man who had nothing left to ruin. Everything had been handed to him, love, loyalty, a home, but he had spent it like loose change. And now, standing alone in the house Ma once warmed with presents, he realized something he hadn't considered before. When a woman leaves without slamming the door, it means she never plans to come back. Meanwhile, Ma found refuge in the quiet part of Enugu, where the roads were lined with trees and the sky stretched wider. She had rented a modest two-bedroom apartment near Abakpa, a space that smelled of new beginnings and freshly painted walls. The landlady was kind, a retired teacher with silver hair and stories that stretched like long Sunday evenings. Ma enrolled Zara in a small daycare nearby and began doing freelance bookkeeping jobs she found online. She no longer dressed to please anyone, but somehow her style returned, bolder colors, stronger fabrics, lipstick with names like Reclaim and Molten Sunrise. Her smile wasn't constant, but when it came, it was clean like water drawn from deep wells. On weekends, she sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching children play in the compound, their laughter reminding her that healing was not an arrival, it was motion. She didn't hate Mark. Hatred required energy she no longer wished to spend on people who chose destruction over love. Instead, she kept her peace like fine china, handled carefully and only shared with those who deserved it. Occasionally, she would glance at her phone, see his missed calls, and simply delete them. No reply. No closure. Some apologies were too late to be relevant. She once drafted a message to him, but deleted it before sending. "You mistook my exhaustion for weakness. But I was only tired from carrying us alone." That said everything, and yet, it didn't need to be said. Not anymore. Peace, she discovered, didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrived wearing no shoes, walking quietly through the back door while you were busy surviving. Months passed. The seasons changed, and with them, Ma's world slowly rearranged itself into something whole. She had begun saving again, tucking money into quiet accounts, investing in Zara's future, and writing at night. She started a blog anonymously, telling stories of betrayal, silence, and the strength that often hid beneath soft voices. Readers responded with comments like, "You're telling my story, and thank you for putting it into words." She never confirmed who she was, never posted her face, but she knew her truth was echoing in places far beyond her small apartment. One afternoon, while picking Zara from daycare, her daughter pointed at a man across the road and said, "That man looks like Daddy." Ma smiled faintly. "Yes, but he's not." She didn't feel the sting she expected. Just a quiet, settled knowing. She had made the right choice. Not just in leaving, but in how she had left. With her dignity intact, her silence weaponized, and her heart still beating. That night, she bathed Zara and read her a bedtime story. The final page showed a picture of a lioness resting beneath a tree, eyes half closed but always watching. Zara yawned and said, "She looks like you, Mummy." And Ma kissed her forehead, replying with a whisper, "She is me." In the stillness that followed, she walked to her room, turned off the lights, and stood by the window, her silhouette strong against the moonlight. The past was behind her now, not forgotten, but no longer holding her hostage. She was not a victim. She had never been. She had been silent, yes, but never stupid. In life, never mistake someone's silence for ignorance or weakness. Sometimes the quietest people are the ones watching the most, thinking the deepest, and planning the wisest. Don't play with the heart that loves you with patience, because when love turns to silence, it may never speak again. Choose honesty. Choose loyalty. And above all, never forget, people remember how you made them feel, long after you've left their lives. May you never be replaced in the home you built with your love. May your loyalty never be rewarded with betrayal. May your tears turn into laughter, and your heartbreak into testimony. May God give you the wisdom to know when to speak, and the grace to know when to walk away. May your silence never be misunderstood, and may your peace never be disturbed. You shall never beg for love, never suffer in silence, and never lose your worth in someone else's eyes. You are covered, guided, and lifted now and always. Amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Turn on post notifications. See you on our next story.